So the other market-based policy we have is tradable permit system. Now in California, we call that cap and trade. In the EU and China, it's called emission trading scheme or emission trading system. The goal is to reduce emission by the most efficient method possible, thereby minimizing the cost to industry by reducing a fixed amount of pollution. Now, how does it do that? So we talked about this in chapter 8. The reason why an emission trading program is able to reduce emission by the most efficient method it offers a flexibility to the firms, where the firms that can reduce emission in the cheapest way possible can reduce the most pollution, and the other firms who has a really high cost, then they will simply buy the permit from those other firms. Right. All right. Now, there's an important distinction or the difference between emission trading system and a carbon tax. Right? In a carbon tax, the government sets the price on carbon. Right? That is the tax. Right? Now, but the government in a carbon tax does not control directly the amount of pollution reduced. Right? The quantity is unknown. Right? I mean, we know that if we implement a tax, yes, pollution will be reduced. We just don't know by how much. Whereas in a tradable permit system, the government does not control directly the price of the permit. Therefore, this does not control the price of the carbon. However, the government can control the quantity of pollution, right, by issuing a fixed amount of the permit. Okay? And what the government can do, if the government wanted to reduce the amount of pollution, all right, thereby also increasing the price of the price of carbon, then the government can allocate less permits, so changing the supply of permit here, that will increase the price. Now the demand for permit is here, so these are right. The demand comes from the inability for firms to reduce emission at a low cost. So the firms which are polluting have two choices. Right? For every ton of carbon that they emit, they can either reduce it or they have to hold a permit. And so therefore, when the government allocates less permit, price of the permit will go up. Vice versa, if the government allocates more permit, right, then the price of the permit will go down. Right? And now, why is the price of the permit important? Well, so here is a nice diagram. We can look at how the price of the permit influence the decisions to reduce carbon emission with each of these technology. So here we have three different technologies that is available to different firms at reducing their carbon footprint. Now, so for example, plant replacement, energy by increasing energy efficiency, and by forest expansion. Okay, so they have different curvature. Now, at this price point, then what we can say is the firms will choose to reduce this much at Q or PR here. Why? Because before this quantity of reduction, it is cheaper to reduce than it is to buy the permit. Now, the firms then will not reduce beyond Q here, because any more pollution that they pollute, they will simply buy the permit as opposed to reduce the pollution, because the permit is cheaper than the reduction past this Q. Same for these other two technologies. Right? And you can see that if the permit price goes down, then the amount of carbon reduced by each of these technology also reduces. If the permit price goes up, then the amount of carbon reduced then increases. Increases, right? And so the high permit price really is essential. It's a signal and an incentive to tell the market to invest more into carbon reduction technology. Okay, so let's look at the two side by side. The carbon tax advantage is there's less uncertainty. And when we say uncertainty, we're talking about the carbon tax. Remember, go back a couple more slides, right? We talked about the importance of having a carbon dividend, meaning having a carbon tax. So with a carbon price, I should say. Now, with a carbon tax, the government sets that price. The government sets the price of carbon. So there's no volatility because that price of carbon is not traded on the market, as opposed to cap and trade, where the price is determined by by the market. And that really is a good way to think about the difference between carbon tax or cap and trade. With carbon tax, you control the price, you do not control the quantity. With the cap and trade system, you control the quantity of pollution, right? But you don't have a direct control over the price. Right? And so when we think about which policy that we prefer, that is an important feature that we should keep in mind. Another couple more advantages of carbon tax is simpler to understand. Right? A permit trading system is complicated, whereas a carbon tax, simple to understand, everybody know what a tax is. Right? There's an incentive to continue to lower carbon emission as technology improves. Because remember, right, the carbon tax is set per ton of CO2. Therefore, the more that any firm can reduce, the less tax that they have to pay. So there's an ongoing incentive for companies to reduce. And finally, it is much easier to implement. You do not have a permit market that you have to orchestrate, and you don't have to worry about allocation of the permit with the carbon tax. Right. Or I should say that with carbon emission, this advantage, cap and trade also have that as well. As long as the permits are binding, as long as there's a shortage of the permit, there will still be an incentive there will also be an incentive for firms to reduce their carbon footprint. Right. Now, carbon trade advantage, it doesn't have the word tax in it. Now, this is not a joke, right? You'd be surprised on how politically heated the word tax can be. Right? So people just generally don't like anything with a tax or with the word tax on it. Also, now this is a very important advantage. Right? Depending on how permits are allocated, it could be a subsidy rather than a tax. So there is an allocation of permits that the regulatory agency have to do. So, for example, California EPA implements the cap and trade system. They have to decide who to give the permits to. Now, remember, these permits are now valuable, right? They are traded on the open market. So, if the EPA decides that a particular firm or industry needs additional help or deserves additional permit, they are able to allocate more permits to individuals if it's suitable. Okay. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about why in some situation why they might want to do that, but at least from the regulatory side, they have that flexibility. You do not have that flexibility with the carbon tax. But by far, the most important feature of a cap and trade and emission trading system is that you can set a target for emission reduction. Now, this is especially important when we're talking about a problem like greenhouse gas. Right? It is essential that we meet a certain annual emission. And so with a cap and trade system, we are able to to set a target and meet and demand that the industry reduces pollution by a certain amount. And we cannot do that with a carbon tax. Okay. Now, with any regulation, but especially carbon regulation, we have to talk a little bit about carbon leakage. Okay. Now, this is some graphics from the EU's emission trading website. Okay. Now, what is carbon leakage? So, actually, the idea of leakage is not unique to just carbon policies. Any kind of environmental regulatory policy suffers from the problem of leakage. And what leakage is, say for example, you are a factory, a company in Italy, and Italy is covered under the EU's emission trading program. Right? So therefore, you are subjected to if you want to pollute, you need to acquire a permit. Now, suppose that you feel you realize that the permit is too expensive and it's too expensive for you to reduce your emission. Therefore, you decided to move your factory out of the country to a less regulated place, to a country that is not covered under the EU's emission trading program. Now, what happened here? So one, Italy lost their job, right? The policy caused hundreds of jobs to be exported out of the country. But more importantly, now there is no reduction of carbon, and in fact, any region that this factory might move to, any country that this factory might move to, most likely, not only would it be more relaxed in terms of carbon emission regulation, but it will most likely be also relaxed in other environmental regulation as well. And so what typically end up happening when leakage happens is you don't reduce the pollution you're intended to reduce. Furthermore, you increase other environmental issues, environmental pollutions in the process. Right? And what do we do with this? We don't have a very good solution here. Right? And so this is unfortunately the official EU stance on their how they tackle leakage, and it is that if a company is susceptible to carbon leakage, there are the EU regulatory agency can simply allocate more emission allowances to relieve the burden, to reduce the burden of to that company, so that it prevents them from moving their factory out of the country. Now, you might say that it sounds kind of like a bribe, and how well can the system work? Okay, and of course, this is highly susceptible to corruption and scam. Although here is something to think about, though. Imagine if you run a company that has been historically very responsible in terms of keeping a low carbon footprint, right? You install solar panels, you run windmills, and you always use low energies and sustainable methods for production. And then now the EU Commission comes in and says tell you to lower your emission even further. You don't have a lot of excess emission to reduce. Whereas suppose that your competitor, right, who is a very irresponsible historically, and is running very inefficient and pollutes far more than you do. Now it is much easier for that company to reduce emission, right, at a much cheaper cost. And so in these kind of situations, right, it could be sensible to allocate more emission permits to you, right, to the more responsible company, right? And because we don't want to reward people for their bad behavior as well. It is complicated. It is we have to look at this on a case by case basis, right? But with an emission trading program, as opposed to a carbon tax, at least we're able to have this flexibility of allocating more permits to a particular firm if we feel that is justified.